guess this definitely follows up kind of your description of environmentalism as a kind of new and improved discourse of the naturals. The question on the relationship between kind of discourse, or more specifically kind of the relationship between ecological discourse and its referent. In our readings, this is something that we've encountered on numerous occasions. We also do a lot of like post-structuralist readings, so this is one of the reasons that we keep encountering the question of discourse. But it seems to us that theorists and environmentalists, advocates are kind of constantly seeking the right concept that will like automatically activate the capacity for ecological thought and consequently ecological action. So we kind of have a general question for the both of you. What are the limits of discourse vis-a-vis the environment? Does environmental crisis, for example, depend on a certain kind of discursive intervention for a solution? Does ecological discourse, as you both see it, attempt to paper over the abyss of the natural, or perhaps to reconstitute the natural as a discursive entity? And specifically, Tim, kind of, you could maybe flesh out a little bit more how your work on ecology without nature dispenses with these kind of discursive constructions of the natural.
Okay. Do you want to go first? Or
Sheer choice.
I wrote these notes. I scribbled some notes on my sheet. My questions. I got my we got given homework to do, and I wrote a lot of notes on here, and so I have things to say. So I can go. And my thing to say about this is, I think the trouble for me is that this idea of coming up with the right concept. Sometimes it's trivially the case that it's simply a matter of sort of advertising language. In fact, I've heard it said that way. Ursula Heiser claims that he said putting his voice onto an MP3 that will be podcast. What we need in environmentalism is a new kind of advertising language because people aren't getting it yet. And I've heard Caroline Merchant saying something quite similar. We in the humanities, our job is to provide the PR, right? Now, I think personally that's not what I do. It might be a bit of what I do, but another thing that what I do is make the advertising language very confusing, and analyze the notion of advertising anything at all, and introduce some kind of theoretical, for want of a better word, hesitation, And so in that spirit, I think the trouble with trying to find the right concept is that there's already an assumption that kind of what you're after, right? So this is why I think that what I'm calling slightly controversially the ecological thought, like it's not ecological thought or ecological thoughts or thoughts in an ecological mode for the chicken soup reader. It's the ecological thought, and we haven't fully thought it yet. And when we think of it, our idea of what ecology is melts, our idea of what our world is melts, our idea of who we are melts. Everything starts melting. Yeah. So that's what I think my job is to not provide that term. That makes me a little bit different from some of the other environmental humanities people who are quite preoccupied with coming up with a new way of seeing what we're already, like a new way of kind of advertising the assumptions that we already have. So in a way, it was easy to write ecology without nature because all I had to do really was say what ecology isn't, right? It cannot rely upon a reified concept such as nature that basically ultimately depends upon a kind of Kantian aesthetic dimension that is predicated on assuming the correct distance towards the object, right? You all know this, right? So that things are beautiful if you have the right distance. Like this would be beautiful, presumably, if you had the right distance towards it. So if it's really, really in your face, or if it's really, really far away, the Egyptian pyramids don't look that good. So the ecological situation that we're in means that that distance is gone, right? Not just the internet, not just virtual reality, but ecological reality, global warming catastrophe, means that distance as such is now impossible without some kind of bad faith, So on the one hand, we've totally lost the background. We've lost that sense of having a world, having a background. So there's no chance of achieving that. So trying to achieve it over and over again isn't working. It's like a bee butting its head against a glass window. And it just reminds me of the sort of Simone de Beauvoir type setup of woman with a capital W on this pedestal. We've got this thing called nature, and that's the beginning of the problem. I mean, you can code it various different ways. You can say it's wilderness, or you can say it's kind of non-conceptuality, or you can say there's some kind of negative theology here of the environment, which I see trying, so that it's unspeakable, yeah, but it still is something, right? It's kind of Derrida has this essay on negative theology where he's saying that difference isn't trying to point to some hyper-essentiality beyond essence. Right? In the same way, ecology is beyond essence. Yeah, that's kind of what it's about.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. And, you know, I've never really studied nature because I don't really know what it is. I think that's what Donna Haraway means by nature culture, that you can't separate them, and so positing this thing out there that is pure nature, not affected by culture, has never made sense to me. I think when I started my work 5 or 6 years ago on animals, I thought I was going to be able to ground it really concretely in endangered species, but you know, I wasn't in that more than a month, and I realized that that world is just as slippery. Sure, we have this idea that tigers are going to go extinct, bonobos are going to go extinct, gorillas are going to go extinct. The whole process of endangerment and counting and even seeing endangered and you know, threatened species is so political. And you know, just to give you a very brief example, almost half of the shark species in the 20th that were present in the 20th century are now thought to be completely gone. And they've never been on an endangered list. They've never been mapped adequately because sharks have no advocates. They're not, you know, they're not an animal we think we love. And so there's nobody kind of watching out for that. And, you know, so the animals we do love are those that, you know, we're watching and counting, but the numbers are very conflicted. How can you count how many polar bears there are? There's no really, you know, efficient way of doing that. So it became just as slippery, but by the time I realized that, I was kind of stuck with the project. And instead of sort of advocating, well, I mean, put it another way. There are lots of different ways of doing endangered species, you know, saving, like ecology. So you got someone like Jane Goodall who just, you know, shoe leather fundraising and can go out and raise $300,000 at a talk and buy protected areas for her chimps, and that's the end of the story. And it takes sort of a really significant kind of persona to do that, and there's not many of them. Most of the rest is this ecotourism, which is really complicated. And you guys have a question later on about environmental racism. There's no worse environmental racism on the planet than this ecotourism, where we're asking poor people to live next door to mostly carnivores, but certainly dangerous animals so that we can come and watch them. And it just gets very sticky. So the outcome of my work on that question, as the panel read, is really that we need to move into a different, not into zoos, but into a sort of democratic, community-based notion of sanctuary. We have a couple here in the Triangle. We have many in North Carolina. And then, you know, nationally, there are all these sanctuaries popping up, which are spaces for animals where they're cared for differently than they are in zoos or in the quote-unquote wild.